Good morning, good afternoon. I'm not quite certain where we are in the day. My name is David Penny. I'm the Associate Director for Museum Scholarship here at the National Museum of the American Indian. And thank you so much for coming out and joining us on this occasion. I'm also I know that there are many College Arts Association people here today, and welcome to Washington. Really glad to have you here. The exhibition is open. WalkingStick, an American Artist, up on the third floor. Certainly invite you to look at that, but also our exhibition, Nation to Nation, Treaties Between the United States and American Indian Nations, and the Inca Road, Engineering an Empire. These are new exhibitions just opened within the last year and a half or so if you haven't been to the NMAI in a while, I invite you to take a look around. We've changed quite a bit. But it's really my pleasure to introduce right now my partner and co-curator for the exhibition, who will tell you a little about what we're going to do this afternoon. So I'd like to introduce Kathleen Ashmilby.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today for our program, and welcome those of you watching us online. For those of you who know Jeff Chang as the author of Can't Stop, Won't Stop, A History of the Hip-Hop Generation, or Total Chaos, The Art and Aesthetics of Hip-Hop, his pairing with the Cherokee artist WalkingStick might seem unconventional, adventurous, or even foolish. However, Jeff Chang is about much more than his extensive writing on hip-hop artists. For over 10 years, he has been a writer and cultural critic with roots in activism, youth and community organizing, and media justice. In 2014, he published the book Who We Be, a provocative look at the trajectory of multiculturalism, using the arts and popular culture as a lens to examine the complicated history of race in the United States. Jeff is the executive director of the Institute for Diversity in the Arts at Stanford University, and we are so pleased he could make time in his busy life to have this conversation with WalkingStick. For those few of you out there who might not know WalkingStick, then you're in for a treat. WalkingStick is one of the most iconic Native American artists who emerged in the 20th century. Her first solo exhibition in New York City was in 1969 at the Cannabis Gallery. She attended Pratt for her MFA in the 1970s and had a successful career which has spanned over 4 decades. I first came to know her work when she was included in the Decade Show, Frameworks of Identity in the 1980s, a collaborative exhibition between the New Museum, the Studio Museum, and the Museum del Barrio, which attempted to bring attention to artists who had been excluded from the mainstream discourse because of their minority status. Of course, WalkingStick was already a known and admired figure in the Native art community, having exhibited her work in several important contemporary Native American art exhibitions, such as Women of Sweetgrass, Cedar, and Sage in 1985 at the American Indian Community House Gallery. Jeff Chang discussed the Decade Show, as well as WalkingStick at length in his book, Who We Be. So we are thrilled to have them together on the stage today to talk about her work and perhaps to continue the discussion about whether artists like her have made progress in the mainstream art world. Please welcome Jeff Chang and WalkingStick.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Kay.
Hi.
How you doing? Good afternoon, everyone. I think there's a lot more connections between us than might seem, out there at first. Your first show was at the Cannabis Gallery.
Don't you love it?
Yeah. And I've done a lot of writing about Dr. Dre's The Chronic, so I think we have a lot in common here. But the way I wanted to start this was that David and Kathleen, I think, have framed the show as WalkingStick, an American artist. Yeah. And
that was important to me.
Yeah?
Yeah.
To me, it's the perfect frame. It makes so much sense because here we are in a time of polarization and Donald Trump and I guess that's redundant to say polarization and Donald Trump, but the idea that you're making art here as a woman, as a mother, as a grandmother, as a biracial person who identifies as Native American, that you're able to do this work with such formal rigor, right? And at the same time, talking about all these different types of issues of land, of identity, of history, of memory, of trauma, of pain, of loss. I love it. That's the American story. This is the American story. You're the American artist. And so I wanted to ask you a lot of questions actually about your story, just to kind of highlight, because there's so many amazing ways in which you've broken through all these different barriers that were placed in front of you. And in a lot of ways, I think people may not realize just how much you've been able to pioneer, I think. And I want to bring that out a little bit, if that's okay.
Never seemed like that when I was doing it, I have to tell you.
But you started off actually drawing in the church. Yeah?
Well, when I was little, yeah, when I was 5 and 6 years old, you know.
Yeah.
But I come from a family of artists, so we drew.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's what artists do.
Yeah. Your father's name was WalkingStick,
Yeah.
and your mother was Scottish-Irish.
Yes.
And you mostly were raised by her and your
I was,
your aunt.
entirely, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the role that your mother and your father played in your early life?
Well, I can't say that my father played any role at all, other than I knew who he was. And my mother had stories about him, most of which I've found out since were not true. It was things that he told her that were just fabricated.
Wow.
Yeah, he was. Anyway, he was what he was. But he did go to Dartmouth. I did check that out, and I went to Dartmouth and looked him up. Interesting, my husband, Dirk Bach, and his father went to Dartmouth as well, so we went to the alumni library and looked up our dads. Wow. And all the things that he told people about himself at Dartmouth were not true, but he was there. He was definitely there. Uh-huh. And my mother had, of course, lived with him in Oklahoma for some years. They were married in 1917, and we came back from the war in 1918. They moved out to Oklahoma, and she didn't leave him until 35. She left him pregnant with me. So she was in Oklahoma, and so she had this experience with native culture there, all the Indian relatives, you know, and she was very pro-Indian, especially Cherokee, of course, and she would brag on the Cherokee accomplishments, like the language and Sequoia, and a written language, I mean, and Sequoia, and the relationship, perhaps not true, but thought by her, to the Aztecs. And there were some reasons for her thinking this that I won't go into, but anyway, she was very pro-Indian, and she would tell me every day, stand up straight and be proud. You're an Indian. And she believed that, and she was always very supportive of her kids and their Indianness. I mean, there weren't that many Indians going to school in Syracuse, New York. There was Onondagas, of course, but our name was very odd to people, and so that we were different. Mm-hmm. We were seen as different. I never thought we looked different, but maybe so. So she was supportive of our difference and really believed that we should be proud. She also believed in women. By this time, of course, she was supporting us, and my Aunt Lil lived with us, and she contributed to the household. And of course, it was Depression. I was born in the Depression. So she would tell me things like, make something of yourself, Kay. A smart little girl should make something of herself. And what she meant was become a nurse, or, you know, become a teacher, or I don't think she ever had any idea of what I would actually decide to do, but she believed that women could do things. and she believed in our heritage was a blessing. I was lucky.
I wanted to ask you about, so you started, I guess, formal study of the arts during your college years. And this is now, I guess, we're talking about the 50s now.
100 years later.
100 years later. At that particular point, women were not being encouraged to be artists.
Well, I went to a women's college, which was a good thing. They also believed that women could do things. I'm not so sure that anybody thought that women could be artists. My college or anywhere else. All the men, all the artists were men. You know, they said that you have to be able to grow a mustache, Kay. You know, I'm working on it. But the thing was that I believed that I could be an artist, and my family believed I could be an artist. And it's true, the only artists in the family were men, but that didn't mean that I couldn't do it. And I knew of a few women artists, and I would read about Helen Frankenthaler and people like that. So such an optimist, I really believed that this was possible.
Yeah, and you're literally doing your painting as you're raising your children in the kitchen. You're doing your painting and doing all those kinds of things.
Terrible paintings. Oh.
Terrible. Well, let's move past the terrible paintings.
Okay, yeah, get past that
and
quickly.
talk about some of the kind of first works that you were doing. You were doing a lot of work that was very 2D oriented, bright colors and that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Who was influencing you at the time? And maybe talk a little bit about this cannabis galleries type scene and what you were finding yourself doing.
There was no smokes. Actually, there was no grass around. I mean, it sounds like, everybody was stoned all the time. I didn't see anybody stoned, much less me. In fact, the police had the gallery phone bugged.
Oh, wow.
Because they figured that any place named Cannabis Gallery must be, selling pot at the very least.
Yeah.
And there was nothing like that. Anyway, very cool guys ran it. I think that I was, like everyone of the period, influenced by what I saw in the galleries. I was in New Jersey, close to New York, so I could go to the galleries whenever I could find a babysitter. And once my kids got into school, of course, I could go in whenever. I did work a little bit at that time, taught part-time, but I did have the free time to look and to go to the galleries. And then, of course, I, like everyone else at that age, I read all the art magazines. I don't read them at all anymore. Isn't that terrible? But I don't. I think that I was influenced by what was going on in the art world at the time a lot. People like Robert Indiana and Wesselman, people like that. They were doing these hard-edge things. And so I was doing these hard-edge, originally they were more abstract, and then I started doing figures. And they're kind of sexy figures. I was that age.
I got to imagine that.
I'll stop there.
You'll see some of it upstairs. But I got to imagine you were like the coolest mom in Englewood, New Jersey at the time. You just had to have been like the most awesomest.
I doubt that, actually, because it was kind of a cool town. But I used to wear moccasins all the time. I love moccasins. I still wear moccasins all the time at home. And so my son said to me, I had a parent-teacher meeting, one of those things that you have to do after school. And he said, Mama, please don't wear your moccasins to school. So I didn't. I thought they were cool. But
Your daughter actually has this amazing, beautifully written piece in the catalog talking about how you started actually one day working on a thing in the backyard, and it became a message to Papa. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. It seems like it was a real key point for you
It
artistically.
was kind of an iconic point because I was at Pratt. I was 38 years old, so I was not a kid. I needed to find out more about my dad. I needed to find out more about my native heritage. I felt it was the time. I had been dealing with feminist issues. I'd been dealing with basically family also. And I felt that it was, my children know. And I felt it was important that I find out more about my Indian heritage. And so I was reading books and, doing various kinds of research like that. And also realized that I had to come to terms with my dad and that I was his daughter. I mean, I look like him. I'm built like him, tall, and big compared to my little Scotch-Irish mother. And so I decided to build this teepee because it is the mainstream idea of Native people. It is not what Cherokees ever lived in. It is not a Cherokee thing, but it's Plains people, home. But it is what the mainstream identifies with Indians with. So, and I wrote a letter to my dad saying that I hoped he forgave me for basically hating him all those years, hating what he did, abandoning his family and all. I hope he forgave me for that. And I forgave him because forgiveness is important. By that time, he was dead, and I intended to burn it, send it up to the heavens. And I couldn't do it. I could not burn it. I just couldn't. But I did. I built it in my backyard, and it's canvas and string and 1x2s and staples and slung paint. I poured paint all over it. So it's sort of an abstract expressionist teepee, if you can imagine a thing like that. And my neighbor said, "Oh, isn't that sweet? You're building a teepee for your kids." And which I thought was kind of a nice thing to say. And I
These days they call that a microaggression, I think.
There you go. So I hung this letter that I had written to my father, and I don't speak or write Cherokee, unfortunately, but he did. And so I copied out the Lord's Prayer in Cherokee, because it's the only thing that I had that was, in Cherokee. And he was raised as a Christian. The Cherokees became Christians very early on because they're East Coast. So they'd been Christians for a couple hundred years by then. And so it was an appropriate thing to hang in there along with this letter from me in strips. And it was kind of a goofy thing to build, actually. Looking back, the kind of cockeyed, but it led me to a whole lot of things formally, as far as the formal art is concerned. And you can see it in the gallery. There is a painting called Teepee Form that I had done of this teepee shape, slightly undraped. But the arcs came out of that, and the stained canvas came out of that staining of the teepee. So it, in spite of the fact it was sort of a goofy thing to do, it was very meaningful for me, and I think affected the formal aspects of the paintings for probably 10 years thereafter.
One of the really interesting things you do out of this, and there's also the pieces that you started to do on canvases, but it seemed like the physicality of creating this piece, and also the notion of the arcs, start feeding a new part of your career here. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about, and the other thing that's happening biographically is that, of course, now you're at Pratt. You are actually in your late 30s. You've started a program there, a graduate program there at Pratt. So one biographical question, and then on to the work. But were you the only woman of your age at that particular point at Pratt?
No.
At that time? No? Okay.
No, in fact, there was, this was the 70s, and there was this big movement to get women back to college and to educate them and treat them as emancipated people, you know, people who could go out and do things. And I won a Danforth Fellowship for Women, which, by the way, the Danforth Foundation no longer does that. But it was to specifically encourage women who had been out of college for a long period, who really wanted to go back to school and develop a career. And so I was fortunate enough to win this very generous, God bless them, a fellowship. And there was another woman there. She didn't have a fellowship, but there was another woman there my age. Actually, she may be younger. The world is younger. But she's around my age, named Joan Giordano, who has been a prominent artist in New York ever since.
So, but you start working now on work that feels a little bit more conceptual in nature.
Oh, yes.
A little bit more, much more formally directed. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this amazing and incredibly powerful Chief Joseph series. Both the formal aspects of it as well as the sort of journey of discovery that you're making in exploring this.
I have to tell you that going to Pratt had a huge influence on me. I was just sucking up ideas, you know, just sucking them up. And I had been going to galleries on my own or with my pal Rachel, and reading the magazines, you know, and thinking about what was going on in the art world. And there was all sorts of things that were going on that were important. For instance, David Penny and I were talking earlier about the notion of showing the process of the art while you're doing it was an important idea in the 70s, right? So that having some of this naked canvas show and having the lines beneath the image show that I put in first, you know, and the whole process of the painting, it was no longer simply an illusion of something. It was about this reality of this object. The painting is first an object. And so that this objecthood became important. And there was the paintings are about 1.5 inches, 2 inches deep. So it made them more sculptural, more object-like. So that all these little ideas that were going on, that were just fermenting in the 70s, were there. And of course, minimalism was important. The notion of reducing things to their minimal aspect and expressing things in a haiku-like way of the simplest way of putting a deep thought, right? And I really enjoyed people like the early Frank Stella pieces, you know, those black and white things in which the white is actually remaindered, and he painted the black but left these little teeny lines of white in it, you know. I thought they were gorgeous. I still do. I still like those a lot. So that all of this stuff was adding up in my head, combined with this concept for me that it was important for me to act upon my thoughts about my father and my own Indianness. And then I was interested in the materials of the period as well. There were people like oh, shoot, I'm sorry. You know, the brain just goes sometimes. I'm sorry, I'm an old lady. But anyway, there are artists that were using wax, and why can't I think of that damn name? I'm sorry. There were artists using various kinds of material, and the materials themselves became important because a lot of the message of any painting, whether it's a Corot, or whether it's a Caravaggio, or whether it's WalkingStick, the materials that I use, that we artists have used, speak to the audience, right? So that what I was putting on the canvas, the material became more and more important as well. As soon as I realized that if I make it thick, a viewer is going to think differently about that painting than if it's thin. It's simple.
So there's this movement that you've made now from very flat surface, hard edge type work to now building up on the canvas these pieces made of beeswax and acrylic, and also stripping back to show the process. It's sort of a formal breakthrough for you. What's interesting is that these paintings have names like Chief Joseph and they're tribute to Sacagawea. Talk a little bit about that, how you were bringing these kinds of ideas together.
Well, as I said, at the same time, I was a very active time in my life, you can imagine. But at the same time I was interested in all these former issues, I was interested also reading about Native history and finding out about my own heritage, my own Native heritage. And so that I, of course, had heard of Sacagawea and read a little bit about her, and really an amazing history, which I won't go into now. But the thing that intrigued me was was a young woman. She was 15 or 16, just a girl, really. Had a baby on her back, and she led these white explorers across the country. She had been captured as a child and taken away, and she led these people back to where she had come from. So that there's this young woman who had done this extraordinary thing, and she was an Indian woman. And I felt very touched and moved by that. And so the painting is called Sacagawea, Leader of Men. And she was, literally, a leader of men. Formally, again, this comes out of the draped shapes, the negative shapes, and the teepee form those big arcs. I put the band around it to give it a sense of depth, so you get a sense of space, of horizon, of landscape. My paintings has always been landscape from some view, and the border is under the paint, but because of its color comes forward visually, so that there was a certain play. De Kooning would have called it push-pull, and I just tell you it's about space. The Chief Joseph came about a little differently. Of course, a lot of people were doing gridded things then, and a lot of those are planned on a grid. And but these related objects that created a progression. I was actually having lunch with my father. I did not see him very often, but I did occasionally, And I said to him something about, this was years before, something about, I'm looking for good Indians. Indians that have nobility. And of course, the more you realize that they're all noble. But I was raised in a time when the Indians were the enemy. In the movies, they were always the enemy. So I wanted some beautiful examples of great Indians. And so I said to my father, can you tell me the name of a great Indian? And he said, absolutely, Chief Joseph. And it was he who started me on this long involvement with the Chief Joseph narrative, which I hope you'll just go and read about sometime. But he was a noble man and a great American warrior, but a great American. And I think that that's what's, for me, really important here, to recognize that this man was not just a great American Indian. He was a great American. Mm-hmm. We are Americans first.
Mm-hmm. And first Americans.
And first Americans.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about well, we're moving now into the period in which you begin to explore the form of diptychs, which becomes, I think, a lot of what you're most known for in your work. And it's really interesting to me to think about works like this, Cardinal Points. There's a whole room as well of pieces that are like this. Cardinal Points kind of opens up this room that are very much
This was the last one I did, by the way.
I'm sorry?
This
that
was
the
last one I did.
Ah, that's so interesting. Mm-hmm. But where you're layering paint and then you're stripping it away, it looks like gashes, it looks like wounds, it suggests trauma, it suggests also layers, depth, it suggests all kinds of
geology.
Ways. Geology, yeah. And you're moving towards the diptychs, but I wanted to also, before we did that, let you know that the other day I had one of my students in, and she's also biracial. She's Nez Perce, and I told her I'm going to go and interview WalkingStick, and I started showing her the catalog, and she started going through this. She said, "Oh, Chief Joseph," and then she saw the Talking Leaves section, and she stopped on the Talking Leaves section, and she's 19 years old, and it just incredibly impacted her. She's like, wow. She wanted to take the book. I was like, no, I need it. I got to prep for this talk. I'll get you a copy, don't worry. But, you know, and I'm wondering if we can maybe talk about this what you start doing here is exploring these sort of dualities, I think, in the Talking Leaves book, and I want to come back then to the diptychs. So here's one of them. And the piece says, "You're an Indian. I thought you were a Jewish girl from Queens who changed her name."
That was actually said to me by a gallery director, also another name I've just lost, but a very prominent gallery director who was, he was being funny, but he
thought he was being funny.
He thought he was being funny, and I thought he was being pretty funny too. But there was a certain truth to it as well. Mm-hmm. You know, that this is the way, you know, I was seen.
Mm-hmm. And this work is actually really interesting because it's not representative of, most of the work you're doing is not figurative, but you have self-portrait here, and then on the left you're doing some of the work that you had done before with carving out letters on this highly layered, sculptured piece.
I'd like to point out that is oil stick on one side, which you can easily cut into because it's wax and oil. And the other side is gouache, which is a very traditional painting that was used by a lot of the southwestern Indians in the 20s and 30s.
But this notion that you're cutting out these quotes that people are making of you, literally, as if they're cutting these quotes out on your skin or something, you know?
Like tattoos.
Yeah, but involuntary.
Involuntary.
These are things that sort of are being told to you. So let's talk about the diptychs and the work that you sort of end up doing for a good long period here.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about like how you created them? And then let's talk a little bit about what you were intending to try to have expressed, what you were hoping for the viewer to try to do. You've now sort of learned all of these different techniques, and you're there's a sort of dialectic of technique that's kind of happening, but there's a very much a dialectic of expression of content that you're trying to create as well. And you're also going through a very difficult period as well biographically at this particular point.
This is 92.
Yeah, your husband had passed.
He'd passed in 89. By this time, I'd kind of come out of it. You know, I'd come out of that hole that you kind of dig for yourself. I'd like to point out that this is actually a diptych. It happens to be a book, but there's two portions. So this also is a diptych. Between these pages, there is between each group of the stupid things that people have said to me, there is a 4 directions cross done in oil stick, very often with some collage to raise the cross a little bit. And the 4 directions cross is I suppose you could call it a pan-Indian symbol. I don't think everybody uses it, but it certainly is used by a lot of Native people across the country. Not very many things are, you know, commonly used by everybody, but this shape is. So it had to do with reminding people that we honor the 4 directions, we honor the earth, and this is who I am, this woman. And that what is said about me and the pictures are part of my experience. But it was important that people see this 4 direction symbol repeated throughout the whole book. I think that very often that's ignored, that here's this page after page after page of the 4 directions cross. It also, of course, for me, relates to Christianity. It isn't, but it's primarily a 4 directions cross. The book was made in response to the Columbus invasion, the celebration of the Columbus invasion of the United States. And there was a huge celebration at that time. And I felt very strongly about that it shouldn't be celebrated quite so as such a glorious thing, after all. And so this was part of that, the comments on that invasion. It was shown in Vancouver, BC in 93, I believe. So that's the time frame.
Let's talk about The Abyss, that piece, which I think may be one of the most shown pieces of yours out there. And the other thing...
I still own it, by the way. It's been shown a lot, but it's scary. It's a scary piece, and I think it's a strong piece. But I don't think anybody wants to have it in their dining room.
There's a lot of stuff happening. You're now working with your hands in doing a lot of the work here. And one of the things that we were talking about before as well is that the sort of non-representation, the abstract side of the diptychs are usually mounted. They're a little bit deeper. The paintings are a little bit deeper, and they're meant to, of course, work together. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what you're trying to experiment with, and also sort of what you're hoping to have the viewer do in terms of trying to get meaning out of the pieces.
You know, that's 3 hours of lecture, actually. But I mean, there was a lot going on.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, the brain is cooking all the time, the way brains do, and the reason for the difference in depth, that's an easy one. I thought of the realistic portion as like a snapshot of the world, like a Renaissance illusion of the world, that it's a window on the world. And it creates an illusion of deep space so that it sinks into the wall. So it was appropriate to have it not a deep canvas, whereas the abstraction was a real thing. It had a quality of sculpture. It entered the room, it entered the space. Rather than showing a deep space that goes back, it came forward into your world, right? And so that this abstraction, it made sense to make it deep. And then I carved into it, and I sometimes raised the portions of it, so it moved as an object. And then, of course, 2 or 3 years later, I realized that the abstraction is so strong as far as the material is concerned, is you really don't have to make it dense. It could be narrow, and it would still be an object, you know? The objecthood was so much a part of that thing. That was my reasons for doing that. But
we should say too, what's happening on the left side, this is sort of, you were living in Ithaca. And
I was living in Ithaca.
And this is a painting of the waterfalls and the rivers in the area.
Yeah, I think it was Fall Creek, actually. And I stood on the edge, and it was springtime, and drawing it, and I realized afterwards that was about as stupid as anybody could do, because, you know, it's muddy, and you can slip. I mean, I was more sure-footed then, but still, I could have been over that fall. So, I mean, it was just so dumb. But anyway, that's
But we got a great painting out of it.
I did get a painting out of it. But I wanted people, for one thing, I wanted to be able to combine the disparate. That made sense to me. That combining these things that are not so different, but people see them as disparate, abstraction and illusionism. And the reality is, a painting is always abstract, no matter how realistic it is. It's built on abstraction. So I wanted this idea of uniting this illusion with abstraction really appealed to me. And it set up a dialogue that I thought was really interesting. I came to it really accidentally. Somebody asked me to make a painting about an elm, and I said, I don't work realistically, and she said, don't worry about it, and I made the elm, of course the Dutch elm disease killed off all of our elms, so I made this painting, this white, that's silvery white, to look like the mold on trees, actually. And then I made a painting of the American elm with
and you
my
were
hands.
actually asked to make this painting because of its symbolism, right?
I think so. I think so, because she thought that Native people honored the elm. Well, I told her the Senecas honor the pine tree, for instance, but I don't think specifically the elm is particularly honored. And she said, well, that's okay. Which I agree. You know, and the thing is, God bless her. You know, she set me on a path, perhaps inadvertently, but she set me on this path of finding a way to combine these things. You know, so in her innocence, she gave me this push to do something different, to challenge myself to do something different, which I thank her for.
And maybe to sort of back out a little bit even further, to kind of explain the context of this. This is during a period in which the U.S. was very polarized as it is now. We're talking about the late 80s, the early 90s, the culture wars, and a period in which there was a push on the part of a lot of folks of color, feminist artists, queer artists, to move into visibility, to move into the mainstream in a lot of respects, and encountering the kind of pushback that you sort of describe or lay out in Talking Leaves, and folks trying to figure out, I think, folks who maybe consider themselves allies, ways to be able to allow more people of color to be shown, and making a lot of mistakes around that kind of thing, but also reinforcing binaries. And so the interesting thing about the diptychs to me is that there's these binaries, right? Like sort of European art and then non-European art and multicultural art and good art, you know, and just I'm just saying these are not my words,
Gotcha.
obviously, but you know what I mean? Like
Yes,
these
I
are,
do.
and so you're making these diptychs at this very moment in which
Yeah.
all of this stuff is kind of swirling, and you're saying, nah, we're putting it right together here,
Yes.
like and
deal,
yeah,
basically.
yeah.
It's together, deal.
Everything has to kind of happen together.
I got a lot of criticism for those paintings when I first started doing them.
From whom?
Oh, gallery people and, you know, people like that. And I think that for me, it just made sense. And I liked the way that dialogue was. But this was, I made the first one in '85. And those of you with remember that history, it was a complicated time. And, I don't know if that was in my head or not, but the truth is you can't avoid what's going on in the world. You cannot. I suppose if you never watched the TV or never opened a paper and hid out, maybe you could, but the truth is that none of us do that. We cannot avoid the zeitgeist of the times. And so that, of course, it affected me. How could it not?
Right. I want to come back to that, but let's move to paintings from your later period. There's this extraordinary piece called Il Regalo, or I'm not pronouncing it correctly.
Il Regalo.
Il Regalo.
Il
Okay.
Regalo.
Sorry. I'm from Hawaii.
Did you look it up? It's the gift.
Ah, that's great. In Hawaiian, the word is makana, the gift. And so you're still kind of now working in these sort of, there are two canvases. Maybe, can you talk a little bit about this particular piece? It's much later.
Let me
it's
take
about,
a look at it.
Okay. It's about,
This
10 years later.
Yes,
So.
and you'll notice I intentionally made the mountain a little bit different where this big female figure is seated and the other side is slightly different color so that they're not one. They're very similar, but they're not one. And you can see the break pretty clearly. I have a funny story to tell you. This was chosen, I was doing a show in Florida. I forget the name of the university. And they wanted to use this on their invitation. They did this lovely big invitation of Il Regalo. As I said, Il Regalo, it means the gift. And the gift was Italy. But there's this big female figure, this Juno-esque, perhaps Selu-esque figure. And the postmaster refused it. They've sent them all out, thousands of them. And the postmaster said, we can't take these. It's, how did he put it? Inappropriate material. So I'm the great Cherokee pornographer.
Wow.
But
I didn't expect this to take that turn, but
sorry.
is that the
Forget
name
that.
of your,
Forget it.
Maybe that's the next exhibition. The pieces now that you are working with in some ways still reflect the diptych form, the idea that you're trying to play with these unities of mythologies and sort of big ideas.
Big ideas. Yeah, I've always been entranced by big ideas. I'm still using a diptych format because I find it very satisfying for me. But today, the sides of the diptych are much more closely related, so that slowly this absolutely binary quality of those early diptychs, that one is corporeal and the other is incorporeal. I've always loved that, talking about big ideas. One is the Earth seen up close. The other is the Earth seen from a distance, this great cosmic look at the Earth. Or if you prefer a closer look at the Earth, it's the geology of the Earth. All of these ideas that were cooking in my little head about what these were about slowly dissipated, and I became more interested in pulling it together so that my most recent paintings have been paintings of the ocean around Aquidneck Island, which is the island where Newport is. And they're sort of a pure landscape. And they're in a diptych format because it still pleases me to do that. As far as the really big paintings that I've been doing lately, I've been usually adding, and you'll see it in the galleries, patterns from people who lived in that area. So if
This is St. Mary's Mountain.
St. Mary's Mountain, and that's northern Cheyenne beadwork that you see there on one side. And this is Glacier National Park. And St. Mary's is the town of St. Mary's in Montana. And this is, of course, the mountain is right behind the town. But adding these patterns, I think, is a reminder that this land, all of this land, is native land. We share it, but it is native land. And I want people to remember that we are, native people, have always been part of this landscape, this America. That I think it was Paul Chet Smith who said, the history of America is the history of native people. And the history of native peoples is our shared American history. And it's true that I want people to remember that. I think it's an important lesson. And talking of multiculturalism, I think it's that acceptance that we are all different, we are all the same, and we're all in it together. And that's what those paintings are about, really, for me.
I have one last question for you. I'm so sorry we're running out of time, but I could just sit at your feet and ask you questions all day.
That's sweet.
I really could, all day and all night. I think I told you that, too, the first time I met you. I could just sit at your feet all day and ask you questions all day. One of the really interesting things about this in the framework of American art is that we think about the landscape paintings that were done in the 1800s, Manifest Destiny, and the role that the paintings played in advancing Manifest Destiny, and the land being sort of seen as this virgin territory out of which all of the natives have been removed, right? And thinking too, I think about the cultural wars now, which are still, I think about these efforts to overcome invisibility. I see that in the student protests. I see that in the Black Lives Matter movement. This idea of, can you see us now? And I'm wondering, from your point of view, what do you think has changed over the time that you've been making your work? And have we changed for the better, or are we still caught in the same kind of binaries? And what can you tell us about where we're headed?
When I was young, and my goal was, one of my goals, my primary goal was to be a good painter, good mom and a good painter. But one of my goals was to try to open the art world to native people in a way that we were just artists to consider for shows, not different necessarily, but just good artists or bad artists or whatever, but we would be considered as part of the mix of American art. that point, I think other people were working on. Jean Quick-to-See Smith, for instance, and many other people were trying to get native art into the mainstream. Why not? And that has improved. You know, that situation has improved. But a lot? I don't think so. I don't think my goal has been realized. Even though certainly there are certainly more venues for native art with other artists of other backgrounds. But there's still a great deal of division. And I look forward to that slowly altering. I think this situation for women is far better than it was in 1959 when I graduated from college. So I have high hopes. I think that the loss of painting is upsetting to me, that fewer and fewer painters are coming out of our school and fewer people are painting, which I think is a tremendous loss. But people still like to look at painting, which is good. Things change, but slowly. I think slowly.
Thank you so much for all your work and for your time. And
my great pleasure.
Keep walking stick.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I have to bow. Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate your kindness, and I appreciate you.
You're awesome. Thank you.